Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analyst will be listing the top 5 compositions for patch 10.17. The meta hasn't really shifted much since last patch, as the balance patch was relatively small for 10.17. Overall, there's a diverse range of comps to play, and there's not a huge difference of strength between them, so keep that in mind as we go down the list. With all that said, let's jump on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back into the video. Kicking off our list, we have Mech coming in as the number 5 composition. Since we're talking about Mech, we do need to point out that there was a hot fix to the health and attack damage of the Super Mech after 10.17 was released. This is the main factor as to why the Mech isn't further down on our list. If the hot fix hadn't happened, the Mech would probably have been either second or first in rankings because of how strong it was. Despite the hot fix, Mech is still doing well and is one of the strongest comps. The impact of the balance change is still yet to be completely seen, but overall the build is still viable. So what is Mech in the current meta? Mech is Mech Pilot mixed with an assortment of other champions. It can be a lot of different things, but for simplicity's sake, we'll focus on the most common variation. There's Mech Pilots themselves, plus Victor as the backline carry, which also provides 2 Sorks. A second infiltrator is common, either Shaco or later on Echo. 2 Mystic is also common and is essential for providing extra magic resistance to your mech. Lastly, there's Demolitionist. This trait is the big reason as to why it's a really strong build later on in the game, because it provides a lot of crowd control between the mech itself and Gangplank. Early on in the game, you'll likely have Ziggs, but as soon as you get Gangplank, you're in a strong position to top 3 most games. Overall, this comp is flexible with an emphasis on being strong mid to late game. The biggest downside is how contested a lot of the champions are, as it can be difficult to find in 2-star Fizz and Gangplank. Let's move on down to the number 4 build on today's list, Cybernetics. Cybernetics prove once again how consistent they are in the meta. If anything, they got slightly better with buffs to Riven, as she was a common addition to this build later on in the game to provide Blademaster and Chrono. There's also variations popping up for Cybernetics that shift the focus from 6 down to 3 and instead go heavy on Chrono. We'll focus today on 6 Cybernetics, which is definitely the more common variation. As always, the core champions for Cybernetics are going to be 6 of them: Vayne, Aurelia, Echo, Leona, Vi, and Fiora. Lucian is an amazing early game carry that eases the mid-game transition for the build, but as soon as you find Echo, he gets the cut. Vayne and Aurelia are your 2 carry options, though Vayne is usually the main carry. From there, you have several options. Wukong adds frontline, Riven or Shen both provide Blademaster and Chrono, and Caitlyn gives you Chrono plus Sniper. Later on in the game, you'll definitely want to Thresh for Mana Reaver, as it helps the build a lot. Ultimately, the best option is what the game gives you, as long as you have your Cybernetics 2-starred. If you're looking for a simple-to-play build that's known to be consistent, Cybernetics is a strong choice. It has an easy transition if you have a good early game with Lucian, Leona, and Fiora. While it is common to get contested playing this build, for the most part that's okay. The only time it's a detriment is in the late game when you're trying to 2-star your Echo. Up next, we have Astro Sniper as the number 3 composition. Astro Sniper is one of the strongest late-game builds by far. It has a good mix of high physical damage and magic damage while providing a ton of crowd control. It's a build that punishes weak front lines but can struggle to get into the enemy backline, since it's very much a front-to-back style build. There are downsides to Astro Sniper. First is just how darn expensive it is. In just the core champions alone, you have multiple 4-cost champions, those of course being Jhin, Teemo, and Gnar. Mixed in with them, you usually see Wukong. So for just 5 champions to get Astro Sniper and Vanguard, there's 4 out of 5 of them being 4-cost units. That's insanely expensive, and it can be difficult to 2-star them all. It's even worse when other players are contesting them. Another issue for this build is how much it hinges on your Teemo and Jhin staying alive. They get crowd controlled or have infiltrators assassinating them, then the build crumbles, and sometimes you won't have the best tools to defend them. But despite all those downsides to the build, it's still, as we said, one of the strongest in the late game. With items like Last Whisper or RFC on Jhin, you're going to do well against the majority of frontline champions, and Teemo punishes anyone that clumps up their units. Along with those two, you have a lot of crowd control between Gnar, Nautilus, Wukong, and of course, Teemo. Astro Sniper is a powerful build, but not always the most consistent. Alright, now onto our final 2 compositions. First, we have Star Guardian Sorcerer coming in at number 2 on today's list. Star Guardian Sorcerer was the build last meta that did well but could easily fall against a lot of the meta compositions. It definitely had difficulties against Mech, and if Gangplank ever got an ultimate off against the squishy Star Guardians, it was usually lights out for the build. But as time went on, players have gotten even better at playing the build, and now it's doing consistently well in the meta. The core champions are going to be relatively rigid, as you want 6 Star Guardians plus 4 Sorcerers. Those champions are Syndra, Nico, Ari, Soraka, Zoe, and Janna for the Star Guardians, and either Victor or Xerath as the 4th Sorcerer. Late game is preferable to have Xerath, as he was buffed in 1017 and does well when paired with Janna. Besides those core champions, you're going to want a second protector to help in the front line and also provide the trait for Nico so she can tank a bit more damage. Usually you're going to see either Jarvan or Rakan, but it really doesn't matter too much which one you use, as they're mainly there to take a few hits and provide protector. If you do make it into the late game, then Lulu is a great champion to add in for Mystic. We do need to talk about the potential downside to this build, and that's the component known as tier. Tiers are extremely contested right now, as they're used for Shojin, Hand of Justice, and most importantly, blue buff. Without blue buff, this build can still do well, but it sure will suffer. Make it your absolute goal to secure this item as quickly as you can, and if you can't, you may want to consider pivoting into a different comp. If you are able to secure a blue buff, then you can play out the game relatively normally until you're level 7. At that point, you can decide if it's worth rolling to hit Syndra 3 and Nico 3. It's one of the win conditions for this build, but it's not 100% necessary if you're strong enough to level and look for Janna plus Xerath. Janna 2 provides a ton of crowd control, so finding and 2-starring her is another win condition for the build. All in all, this composition isn't really that flexible, but it's certainly powerful when you get all the pieces you need for it. It's a great mid-game build with a strong late-game potential. And the composition coming in at number 1 for today is Rebels. It's worth keeping in mind that even though Rebels are our top composition, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be the strongest. What makes them our number 1 build is the fact that they have an ultra strong late game with Gangplank, Aurelion Sol, and Jinx. They also have a really good early game if you manage to find a Ziggs 2 with Malphite, another Rebel, and Rumble. So what are the downsides to Rebels? Well, they have a weak mid game if you're not high rolling champions. They can start and end strong, but that mid game is a weak point as you're in the middle of transitioning towards 6 Rebels, but don't quite have the late game champs yet. Jinx is a big factor as you need items for her and you need to 2-star her to help carry you to level 9. Given how contested she can be, it's not always feasible to find her early enough in the game or even 2-star her before level 8. This means unless you have 2-starred every other champion in your build, you're often going to struggle in the mid game and lose a bunch of health. One other downside is that Gangplank isn't easy to find in 2-star, especially given how contested he is. The difference between first place and a top 4 in Rebels is often whether or not you've managed to find a Gangplank 2. Aurelion Sol is also important, but he's viable as a 1-star champion. Gangplank, on the other hand, needs to be level 2 for the extra damage, but most importantly, the extra health to survive longer. But despite those downsides, Rebels are an amazingly strong comp. It's one of the best builds to aim for if your goal is to get a first place finish. And that is going to be a wrap to our top 5 compositions. Before we end today's video, we still have a few builds to talk about as our honorable mentions. First up for our honorable mentions, we have Slash Bros. This composition focuses on Master Yi as the main carry with the 6 Blade Master trait to empower him. At peak performance, it's one of the best builds for getting a first place, but the reason it's just an honorable mention is how feast or famine it can be. Between small nerfs to Master Yi and the meta shifting slightly out of its favor, it's once again a very inconsistent build. This means that you can get a first place with it, but you're also just as likely to bottom 4 with it. It hinges on a few things to do well. One of those things is that you absolutely need ideal items for Master Yi, which means a lot of bows. At minimum, you're going to need 3 bows to make RFC and Runan's Hurricane. Without those 2 items, your Yi is just going to be too weak. The 3rd item is flexible, but generally you either want a second Runan's, meaning more bows, or an AP item like Deathcap or Jeweled Gauntlet. Another factor to consider for this build is that to win, you need Master Yi 3. That means if you're low rolling or being contested, you're going to have an incredibly difficult time getting him 3-starred. Without Master Yi 3, your chances of winning go down drastically, and it can be even a struggle to get a top 3. But as we said, it's a build that can do well if you meet all of the requirements. We won't recommend you force this build, but if you get a good start for it, it's definitely worth playing. Our next honorable mention is Dark Stars. Dark Stars means that you want at least 4 Dark Stars with 2 of them being your main carries. Generally, these will be Jhin and Shaco, but Xerath is a suitable late game carry as well. The reason for this build being viable is it's a cheaper form of Astro Sniper. You get the power of Jhin mixed with the backline access of Shaco while having decent supporting champions between Mystics and your frontline. Another benefit is that the champions are relatively uncontested. Yes, you're going to see a lot of mech players going for Shaco, and Astro Sniper will of course want Jhin, but you should be able to 2-star both champions in most games. The rest of your composition, which will be a mix of frontline Mystic and a second Infiltrator, is flexible enough that you'll be able to find what you need easily. This build will struggle the later the game goes on. It's susceptible to magic damage focused builds as they can straight up one-shot your Jhin or Shaco, and crowd control can often be an issue. Both of those are common to see late game, which is why this build is more for the mid game. If you can do well enough in the mid game, you can transition into a more late game focused build. There is a late game win condition though, and that's Shaco 3. Shaco 3 with a Bloodthirster, Guardian Angel, and a third item is an absolute beast. He can carry you late game, though crowd control is still an issue. Without him though, the build is best played to get the most out of the mid game and coast towards the top 3 placement. And that is going to be it for today, folks. This is a well-balanced meta and quite varied, so don't worry too much about having to play the best composition to climb. Let us know in the comment section below what comp you've been having the most fun with in 1017. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.